Hey there, my name is Ben Everingham and I'm the director here at Pumped On Property, and in today's video I'm going to talk about could Brisbane actually take over as Australia's top performing housing market in the next 5 years. So this video is going to be filled with some really useful information. If it's the first time watching one of my videos, welcome. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel and feel free to leave me some comments. If there's other videos you'd like me to record, I'd love to know what they are so that I can get onto them for you. But in today's video, we're going to talk about future population growth and future job growth projections by some of Australia's leading analysts. We're going to talk about the new jobs that were created in 2017. We're going to talk about interstate and overseas migration rates, as well as the property price gap between Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane right now, as well as the average household income gaps. And then we're going to talk about the last 10 years as well. So it's going to be quite an action-packed video today. Lots of good data in there, and really just looking at that concept of could Brisbane actually take over as the top performing housing market in the next 5 years. So this was actually inspired by an article I saw by Tim Lawless from CoreLogic a couple of weeks ago that had some really good data in it, as well as some other information that I've picked up from some of the analysts that I follow recently too. So the first thing I'm going to talk about today is future population growth. Now, I was recently at a Michael Matusik masterclass, and Michael Matusik's a leading analyst in Australia who looks at forecasts for the present and the future. And one of the things that he mentioned that I took away was that 75% of Australia's population growth and job growth is going to come in 3 markets over the next 10 years in Australia. Now, those 3 markets are Sydney, Melbourne and Southeast Queensland. So he suggested that roughly 25% would be Sydney based, 25% Melbourne based, and then 25% Southeast Queensland, which is really Brisbane, Sunshine Coast and Gold Coast, which is going to become long-term probably a super city. So with 25% of the population growth of Australia and 25% of the job growth in Australia, which is the equivalent to the same growth in Sydney and Melbourne in the next 10 years, Southeast Queensland and Brisbane looks really interesting. On top of that, and the second thing that I wanted to talk about was the new jobs actually created just in 2017 alone. So CoreLogic got some data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and what they found was that there are 113,000 new jobs created in Queensland last year, which was actually a higher number than the amount of jobs created in New South Wales and Victoria. So really interesting trend. Now, those guys do modify and play with the numbers based on the political cycle, and you know, there's people in the industry that think those numbers might be being artificially inflated by the government at the moment. But regardless of, you know, the numbers, that is very strong growth and good for positive sentiment. So the third thing that I wanted to talk about was interstate migration, and what's just occurred in 2017, which hasn't happened for a long time in Queensland, is that interstate migration, meaning Australians moving to other places in Australia, or other areas of Australia. More Australians are moving into Southeast Queensland and Brisbane right now than are moving into Sydney and into Melbourne. Now, Melbourne's been leading the way for interstate migration since 2013, and before that it was Sydney. So Brisbane's just taken that reign, and I think that's got a lot to do with job growth, population growth and overall affordability of this market, as well as unaffordability in some of those other markets. So really nice indicator as well, which could set things up for a positive future in Queensland. The fourth thing I wanted to talk about is what I call the property price gap, and that is the difference between the average price of houses in one market versus the average price of houses in another market. And so right now houses in Sydney are 102% more expensive than they are in Brisbane. And one other thing to go along with that is that the average household income in Sydney is only 12.9% higher than the average household income in Brisbane right now. So that means prices are over 100% more expensive, but income is only 12% more. So from an affordability and a lifestyle perspective, as a lifestyle location with great employment, Brisbane is going to become more and more attractive to people, young families, retirees that are just sick of the rat race in Sydney and Melbourne and sick of being priced out of the market, or that have gone through a couple of good property cycles, have all of this equity in their home but no cash, and want to come up here, pay for a property outright and have a good chunk of money in the bank, as well as be able to get a good full-time job long term. So that property price gap's also important between the Brisbane and Melbourne markets. So right now, the property price gap between the average house in Brisbane and Melbourne is 57%. What was really interesting and crazy for me to find out is that the average income in Brisbane is actually now higher than the average household income in Melbourne. So that's the first time it's been like that for a long time. And there's always been this concept that Melbourne and Sydney are where the money is and there's no money in somewhere like Brisbane or anywhere else in Australia, but that's simply not true anymore. And that's really interesting as well, because if you can come here and earn the same money or a bit less than Sydney, but the property prices are 50 to 100% cheaper, looks really interesting, and there'll be a lot of people being forced out of those markets as a result of this. The fifth and last thing that I wanted to talk about, I hope I'm getting my numbers right on today's video, is the last 10 years. Now, the last 10 years in Sydney and Melbourne have been relatively good, in particular the last 5 years in both of those cities, where property prices, depending on whose data you looked at, in the last 10 years would have gone up sort of between 60 and maybe 80% in those cities. Brisbane, on the other hand, has had a very slow 10-year period. Again, depending on whose data you're looking at, the average growth of the average property in Brisbane could have been between 1% and 2% per year for the last 10 years. So there's some people that also believe that the average price growth in Brisbane has actually been below the average inflation rate of Australia. So property is effectively much more affordable here than it was 10 years ago. So there's some of the things that I think are interesting at the moment for the Brisbane marketplace. It's certainly worth a conversation at the moment, with Heron Todd White saying that Brisbane has just entered the rising stage of the market, Sydney in the decline phase, and Melbourne approaching the peak of the market. It's worth having a look at. It's worth subscribing to some of those really good resources like the Core Logic, email updates, and getting real access to this data, like the Michael Matusik updates, like our updates. I try and send out a weekly or a fortnightly email with videos like this with heaps of really interesting information in it. I hope you've enjoyed today's video and this nice little snapshot of what's happening here. It's a question I'm certainly asking myself as an investor that wants to continue to buy property up until the next financial crisis, which might be a while away still. So be keen to hear your thoughts, and obviously if you're finding great resources and great pieces of data that other investors that would be watching this video would like to see, please link them at the bottom there, and that way we can share the love and everyone can learn together. So thanks for your time and attention, and have a great day.